We would like you to please join me in thanking Factor for sponsoring today's episode. Do you want to get chef-prepared meals on the table in 2 minutes? Head to factormeals.com/cold50 and use code COLD50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month. That's factormeals.com/cold50 and use code COLD50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month. Enjoy the show.
July 10th, 1999, Pierrefonds, Quebec. 42-year-old Janet Kuchinsky leaves her residence in order to go out for a walk, but never returns. The following morning, Janet's body is found in a wooded area next to a bicycle path located 1 kilometer from her home, and she has been bludgeoned to death by a blunt instrument. Months later, a serial killer named William Patrick Fyfe is charged with the murders of a number of other women, which also occurred in the West Island region of Montreal during this time period. But no evidence links him to Janet's death, and her murder is never solved. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be traveling back to our podcast's home country of Canada to cover a pair of cold cases which took place in the West Island of Montreal, the 1999 murder of Janet Kuchinsky and the 1996 murder of Andre Lalonde. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Talia Gilbo-Miskovich, the latest winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Talia. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been carrying on for 7 years now, so if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions near the end of this episode. Anyway, the murder of Janet Kuchinsky is the case that Talia requested I cover when she originally entered this contest because it took place in her husband's hometown and he actually knew the victim. The crime recently passed its 25-year anniversary, but since there isn't a whole lot of information available about the case, I'm also going to be covering the unsolved murder of Andre Lalonde. The two crimes are definitely not connected, as Janet Kuchinsky was a beloved wife and mother who was attacked and bludgeoned to death while walking on a bicycle path near her home, whereas Andre Lalonde was a veteran constable with the Montreal Urban Community Police who was shot to death during what should have been a routine traffic stop, and he lost his life only a few months before his retirement. The main similarity between these stories is that they both took place in the West Island of Montreal, Quebec, which is a mainly residential suburb of the city and has never been known for having a lot of violent crime or unsolved cold cases. Janet Kuchinsky was murdered in the borough of Pierrefonds, while Andre Lalonde was killed while on patrol in the village of Senneville. But in the years following these crimes, a province-wide municipal reorganization took place, which led to Pierrefonds being joined up with Senneville and merged into the city of Montreal. However, in 2004, the residents of Senneville voted to demerge from Montreal and become their own independent municipality again, so Pierrefonds would instead be merged with the town of Roxborough. The murders of Janet Kuchinsky and Andre Lalonde are two of the only unsolved cold cases from the Pierrefonds-Senneville area, so in this episode, I'll start off by profiling Janet's murder before I share my theories and analysis, and then I'll move on to Constable Lalonde's story. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 70 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives which are not available in our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by exploring the murder of Janet Kuchinsky. Our first story begins in 1999 in Pierrefonds, Quebec, which at the time was an independent town located on the West Island of Montreal, which had a population of around 54,000. Our first victim is 42-year-old Janet Kuchinsky, who lives in Pierrefonds with her husband Harvey Kuchinsky and has 3 children, 19-year-old Eric, 16-year-old Sarah, and 14-year-old Megan. Janet is employed as a daycare worker and is a very well-liked person in the community who is known for doing a lot of volunteer work and having a very jovial and compassionate personality. At around 5:40 p.m. on the evening of Saturday, July the 10th, Janet left her residence on Fraser Street in order to go for a power walk, but even though she was planning to have dinner with her family following her return, she never came home. When 5 hours passed and Janet failed to resurface, her husband Harvey became concerned enough to contact the Montreal Urban Community Police in order to report her missing. While the police performed a cursory search of the area that night, they were unable to find anything since it was too dark, so the following morning, the Kuchinsky family and a team of around 40 volunteers began their own search effort for Janet. Well, just before 10 a.m., one of the volunteers would discover Janet's body in a wooded area next to a secluded, overgrown bicycle path located off the tip of Boulevard des Sources near Riverdale Street. She had been severely bludgeoned after being struck on the head several times with a blunt object, and her cause of death was determined to be multiple skull fractures and blood loss. Janet's jacket was partially off, which seemed to indicate that she had gotten into a struggle prior to her death. Since Janet was still wearing her jewelry, robbery did not appear to be the motive for the crime, but even though she was not sexually assaulted, it was speculated that the killer may have attempted to do so by dragging her body off the bike path into the woods. The murder took place about a kilometre from Janet's home, but since she frequently went for power walks in that area, she was well known by the local residents, who nicknamed her the Walking Lady. Witnesses did recall hearing the sounds of a woman screaming between 6 and 7 p.m. on the night Janet went missing, which is when the crime likely took place, and Janet's screaming may have scared off the perpetrator from assaulting her. Since Janet was so beloved within the community, one of her friends, Penny Lavoie, told the media, quote, "She put her family and community first. She didn't have an enemy in the world, only a million friends. That's why I'm sure a stranger did it," end quote. Tragically, Janet's murder took place only 4 days before she was scheduled to celebrate her 23rd wedding anniversary with her husband. Her funeral will be held the day after her anniversary at Rideau Memorial Gardens in the nearby suburb of Dollard-des-Hermonts, and it was attended by over 300 people, which meant that only about 2/3 of them could fit inside the chapel, while the others remained outside in the corridor. Instead of bringing flowers to the service, the Kuchinsky family asked that donations be made in Janet's name to the Beckett Players, an amateur theater troupe she volunteered with who raised money for children's charities. For the next month, police would have no success at finding Janet's killer, but shortly before midnight on August 14th, a 17-year-old girl was walking her dog in the area of Riverdale Boulevard and Place Riviera, only 2 blocks away from the spot where Janet was killed. She was suddenly accosted from behind by a bearded white male who appeared to be in his mid-30s and was wearing a dark blue hooded sweater. He grabbed the girl's arm and said, quote, "Don't be scared," but she responded by screaming very loudly and was able to break free from the man before running off with her dog. When she made it back home to her apartment, she immediately called 911, but while police performed an extensive search of the area for the assailant, they were unable to find him. There was immediate speculation that this man could have been the same person responsible for Janet's murder, but while a composite sketch was created for him and circulated throughout the media, I do not believe he was ever identified. Well, over the course of the next few months, the West Island would experience great fear when 2 other women were murdered in suburbs located near Pierrefonds. On the evening of October the 15th, 59-year-old Anna Yarnold was found bludgeoned to death next to the garden in the backyard of her home in the village of Senneville. She had been struck on the upper part of her body with a blunt instrument, and much like Janet, Anna had been involved in amateur theater since she produced and acted in plays for a West Island theater company called the Lakeshore Players. In spite of some similarities between the two crimes, the Montreal Urban Community Police stated that they found nothing to indicate that Anna and Janet's murders were connected. Well, 2 months later, on December the 15th, a 50-year-old woman named Mary Glenn was bludgeoned and stabbed to death inside the living room of her home in Baie-d'Urfé, another suburb located in the West Island of Montreal. This caused fear that there was a serial killer in the area, but the perpetrator left a thumbprint in some blood on a kitchen door frame in the residence, and it wasn't long before it was matched to a 44-year-old suspect named William Patrick Fyfe, who had previously been charged and convicted of theft and breaking and entering over a decade earlier. While Fyfe resided in Montreal and worked as a handyman, he had recently left the area to visit his mother in Barrie, Ontario, so he was placed under 24-hour surveillance by the Ontario Provincial Police. On December the 21st, Fyfe dropped off 3 pairs of running shoes at a closing donation bin at a church, which were subsequently retrieved by police, who noticed spots on them which appeared to be blood. The following day, Fyfe was arrested and taken into custody at a truck stop before he was extradited back to Quebec on the charge of first-degree murder. Naturally, given the similarities between the two crimes, the Montreal Urban Community Police believe that Fyfe may have also been responsible for killing Anna Yarnold, and sure enough, in February of 2000, he was finally charged with her murder after traces of Anna's blood was found on clothing which belonged to him. On the very same day, Fyfe was also charged with the murder of 46-year-old Monique Gaudreau, who was stabbed to death at her home in the town of Saint-Agathe-de-Mont, located 80 kilometers northwest of Montreal. Monique's murder took place on October the 29th, just 2 weeks after Anna Yarnold was killed, and one of the pairs of shoes that Fyfe had disposed of wound up matching bloody shoe prints found at the crime scene. Well, in June of 2000, DNA testing would lead to Fyfe being charged with the murders of 2 additional victims. One of them was 55-year-old Teresa Lissac-Shanahan, who was sexually assaulted, beaten, and stabbed 32 times inside her apartment in Laval, the largest suburb of Montreal, on November the 23rd, meaning that Fyfe was responsible for murdering 4 Quebec women during one 2-month period. Fyfe's 5th confirmed victim was 52-year-old Hazel Scatallon, who was sexually assaulted and stabbed 27 times inside her apartment in the suburban town of Montreal, all the way back on March the 21st, 1981. In September of 2001, Fyfe agreed to plead guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder and received a sentence of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Well, shortly thereafter, Fyfe agreed to a deal in which he would confess to 4 other unsolved murders in exchange for being transferred from a Quebec prison to the Maximum Security Regional Psychiatric Center in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. While Fyfe was never formally charged or tried with any of these crimes, his 4 other victims were 62-year-old Suzanne Marie Bernier, who was sexually assaulted and stabbed to death inside her apartment in Montreal's Cartierville neighborhood on October the 17th, 1979. 26-year-old Nicole Raymond, who was sexually assaulted and stabbed to death inside her apartment in Pointe-Claire just 4 weeks later on November the 11th. 37-year-old Louise Blanc-Poupard, who was bound, raped, and stabbed 17 times inside her basement apartment in Saint-Adèle on September the 26th, 1987, and 45-year-old Pauline Laplante, who was bound with telephone wire, raped, and stabbed 37 times inside her residence in the municipality of Piedmont on June the 9th, 1989. At the time of this recording, Fyfe is currently 69 years old and is still incarcerated, but while he has never been conclusively linked to any crimes besides the 9 murders he confessed to, the authorities have not discounted the possibility that he may have had additional victims. Needless to say, given that Janet Kuchinsky's murder took place only a few months before Fyfe killed 4 of his victims, he was looked at as a possible suspect, but Fyfe has always denied any involvement, and no evidence has ever linked him to this crime. Indeed, investigators believe this crime did not fit Fyfe's MO, as his other known victims were all killed inside their homes, whereas Janice was attacked outdoors in a public place. Shortly after the 1-year anniversary of Janet's murder, 3 anonymous benefactors would offer a reward of $20,000 for information leading to the arrest of the killer. The amount was later raised to $25,000, but the reward did not pave the way to any strong leads, and it eventually expired. In June of 2001, it was announced that a children's playroom at the newly built West Island Palliative Care Residence, a home for terminally ill patients, was going to be named after Janet, as her theater troupe, the Beckett Players, donated $50,000 towards the cost of the room. Just over 4 years later, in October of 2005, a commemorative ceremony was held to unveil a new monument at Greer Park in Pierrefonds, which would memorialize 2 murder victims from the area, Janet Kuchinsky and Kellyanne Drummond, a 24-year-old daycare center educator who was stabbed to death by her estranged boyfriend at her apartment on October 3, 2004. Ironically enough, at the time of Janet's murder, one of Kellyanne Drummond's sisters had been dating her son, Eric. This memorial would be placed alongside a second monument, which honored another murder victim from Pierrefonds. 21-year-old Anne-Marie Edward, who was one of the 14 women shot to death during the infamous École Polytechnique massacre at the University of Montreal on December 6, 1989. But of course, unlike the other 2 victims on those monuments, the identity of Janet Kuchinsky's killer is still unknown, and after 25 years, her murder continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, I'd like to take a few moments to thank our newest sponsor, Factor. As I'm sure you're well aware, summer is finally here, which is a season when you would rather be outdoors doing fun stuff rather than spending a lot of time preparing meals. You never want to be trapped in a situation where you're forced to utter the words, I guess you could say, the meal went cold. That's why this is an ideal opportunity to help yourself to Factor's no prep, no mess meals, which are always fresh and never frozen, and they also happen to be dietitian approved. Most importantly, their nutritious, great-tasting meals are always ready to eat in just 2 minutes, no matter how busy you may be. Today is the day you really want to kickstart a new healthy routine, so head to factormeals.com/cold50 and use code COLD50 to get 50% off your first box, plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active. They have about 35 different meals and more than 60 add-ons to choose from every week, which means you'll always have new flavors to explore. You can treat yourself to restaurant-quality meals that feature premium ingredients like filet mignon, shrimp, and blackened salmon. I know that I've just been browsing factormeals.com and have seen quite a few meals that greatly appeal to me. I just mentioned shrimp and filet mignon, and wouldn't you know it, they just happen to have a delicious-looking fajita-spiced shrimp and filet mignon meal, which is served over roasted bell peppers and topped with fajita-spiced butter and accompanied by sides of creamy cauliflower and zucchini tossed in a smoky chili garlic cream sauce. And while we're on the subject of salmon, there's a great herb cream cheese salmon meal available, which is served over creamy grits made with cauliflower and red pepper with broccoli on the side. You'll never run out of great options on Factor's menu. So once again, head to factormeals.com/cold50 and use code COLD50 to get 50% off your first box, plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active. That's factormeals.com/cold50 and use code COLD50 to get 50% off your first box, plus 20% off your next month. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. So this is obviously a very frustrating cold case, as we have a victim who left her home for what was supposed to be a short period of time in order to partake in an activity that she pretty much did every day, but she wound up crossing paths with someone who murdered her. And this individual did not leave much in the way of evidence behind and has managed to get away with it for the past quarter century. Like I mentioned in the intro, Pierrefonds and the West Island of Montreal were not known for having much in the way of violent crime back then, though 2 more women from the area would be brutally murdered by the end of the year. Janet Kuchinsky was also a victim who seemed to be universally beloved within the community and did not appear to have any known enemies who would have had a motive to commit this crime. On one hand, it definitely seems believable that Janet was murdered by a complete stranger whom she just happened to bump into while walking on the bicycle path. The perpetrator could have been a predator who was simply lying in wait in the wooded area next to the path with the intent of sexually assaulting a woman, and Janet was selected completely at random because she just happened to show up there at that particular time. Since none of Janet's jewelry was stolen, it does not appear that robbery was the motive, and for all we know, the perpetrator may not have been planning to kill anyone, but things escalated into murder when Janet put up a fight. 1 month after this crime took place, a 17-year-old girl was accosted in the same area only 2 blocks away by a man in his 30s, and as far as I can tell, I don't believe he was ever caught or identified. It's certainly possible he could have been the same person who killed Janet, and since he never got the opportunity to sexually assault her, he decided to go after another victim. But since this girl managed to get away and called the police, I'm sure this guy knew he would be running a huge risk of getting caught if he went after anyone else in Pierrefonds. But on the other hand, even though most people are inclined to believe that Janet's killer was a stranger, I guess we can't completely rule out the possibility that she could have been attacked by someone she knew. Since Janet had earned the nickname the Walking Lady, it seemed to be common knowledge that Janet loved to go on power walks in the area. I don't know if it was her ordinary routine to go walking on that particular bike path during the early evening hours, but if she frequently did that, then someone could have figured out Janet would be there at that particular time and was lying in wait for her to arrive. Now, unfortunately, because this is one of those crimes which may have been completely random, it could be quite difficult to solve. I know that Canadian law enforcement is much more stringent than American law enforcement about withholding details from the public, so I'm not sure what physical evidence, if any, they have. I haven't heard anything about them having samples of the perpetrator's DNA, but it would not surprise me if they do not, given that Janet was not sexually assaulted and she was bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument, as it's possible to commit murder like that without leaving DNA behind. If they do have DNA evidence, then it obviously didn't match William Patrick Fyfe, as his DNA was used to link him to a couple of the murders he committed, so they do have it on file. Since we have no strong suspects or much in the way of leads, there isn't a whole lot to analyze here, so I guess our main point of discussion is whether or not Fyfe could have been the perpetrator. The guy is one of the worst serial killers in the history of Canada, and while he has admitted to his involvement in at least 9 murders, the authorities have not ruled out the possibility that he may have additional victims. Given that Fyfe confessed to a bunch of additional crimes as part of a deal to get him transferred to the Regional Psychiatric Center in Saskatchewan, you might be wondering why he wouldn't have confessed to Janet's murder if he was responsible, but serial killers can be very manipulative people. Even if they reach the point where they're not going to be incarcerated for the rest of their life and have nothing left to lose, they will sometimes not be truthful about the full extent of their crimes, or alternatively, they will falsely confess to crimes they did not commit, because they still enjoy the opportunity to keep themselves the center of attention and wield power over the authorities. On the surface, it does seem like quite a coincidence that so many women would be murdered in that region of Quebec during such a short amount of time, but I can understand why investigators would not be inclined to believe that Fyfe was responsible for killing Janet, since the crime does not seem to fit his MO at all. All of Fyfe's other known crimes were calculated home invasion murders in which he killed his victims inside their places of residence, so it would be very out of character for him to attack a woman while she was outdoors in a public place. In many of these murders, Fyfe robbed his victims and used their ATM cards to withdraw money from their bank accounts, but Janet's killer made no attempt to steal anything from her and left her jewelry behind. Many of Fyfe's victims were sexually assaulted, but Janet was not, and it appears that his other victims from 1999 were targeted because they were vulnerable, middle-aged women living alone. And while I don't want to downplay the severity of Janet being struck in the head multiple times with a blunt instrument, her death does not have the same level of brutality of Fyfe's murders. His crimes fit the definition of overkill, as Mary Glenn was bludgeoned so badly that she was virtually unrecognizable, and many of Fyfe's other victims were stabbed several times. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not entirely certain that Janet's death was a premeditated murder, as the perpetrator may have only been intending to commit sexual assault, but things escalated into him killing her. While we still can't be certain that the man who tried to attack the 17-year-old girl in Pierrefonds 1 month later was Janet's killer, I seriously doubt that it was Fyfe, since he does not resemble the composite sketch, and this suspect was described as being in his mid-30s, whereas Fyfe would have been 44 years old. And once again, it wasn't Fyfe's MO to attack people in public, and the majority of his known victims were middle-aged women. Overall, I am inclined to think that Fyfe did not commit this crime, and it's just a tragic coincidence that there happened to be more than one murderer operating in the West Island area in 1999. But this still leads us to the question of whether Janet's killer was a stranger or someone she personally knew. It sounds like the majority consensus is that she was murdered by a stranger and was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, but until someone pops up on the radar as a promising suspect, we'll never know for certain. All we do know is that a woman who was by all accounts a wonderful wife, mother, and overall person had her life senselessly stolen away, and the responsible party has managed to elude justice for 25 years. I guess the best we can hope for is that this person has wound up going to prison for another crime and is currently locked up and unable to hurt anyone else. Whatever the case, at least Janet has managed to leave behind a great legacy in Pierrefonds and will always be memorialized by that monument in Greer Park, but it would be nice if her loved ones could receive some answers. So if you happen to have any information about the unsolved murder of Janet Kuchinsky, please contact Le Service de Police de la Ville de Montreal at 514-280-2222. That's 514-280-2222. So now let's move on to our next case. Our second story begins in 1996 in Senneville, Quebec, an affluent suburban village located in the West Island of Montreal, which had a population of 973 residents at that time. Our second victim is 51-year-old Andre Lalonde, who lives in the suburb of Saint-Eustache with his wife Nicole and also has 2 adult children, 28-year-old Natalie and 22-year-old Patrick. Andre is a 29-year veteran with the Montreal Urban Community Police and is currently assigned to Station 11 in the suburb of Kirkland and holds the rank of constable. Due to his friendly and compassionate personality, Andre is very well liked and respected by his peers, and is known throughout the community for having a distinctive handlebar mustache. At this particular point, he is only 2 months away from retirement, and he has already made a number of plans. Andre and Nicole have sold their house in Saint-Eustache, and on Sunday, April the 28th, he made arrangements to purchase a motorhome, as after Andre retires, the Lalondes are planning to use it to travel to Alaska. On the morning of Monday, April the 29th, Andre was not originally scheduled to work, but he decided to pick up an extra shift since it would allow him to accumulate enough hours to retire a bit earlier than planned. Constable Lalonde was working a seemingly routine patrol in Senneville alongside his partner, who decided to travel back to the station in Kirkland in order to pick up a radar gun, leaving Lalonde alone. At around 10:15 a.m., Lalonde was trailing a brown 1991 Ford Tempo through one of the suburban neighborhoods and pulled the vehicle over at the corner of Elwood Avenue and Senneville Road. Before he climbed out of his patrol car, Lalonde radioed to dispatch that the vehicle had a faulty and noisy muffler, but since this seemed to be nothing more than an ordinary traffic stop, he did not run a check on the license number. When Lalonde approached the Tempo's driver's side, he was immediately shot at point-blank range with a .357 caliber handgun. 2 of the bullets struck Lalonde in the chest, while the third shot hit the handle of a service revolver while it was still inside the holster, causing the bullet to fragment and parts of it to lodge into his forearm and side. After Lalonde fell to the ground, the Tempo sped away from the scene, and another motorist who was passing through the area at that time would later tell police that he got a brief glimpse of the driver and described him as being a white male with brown hair who appeared to be between 25 and 30 years old. A resident in the neighborhood heard the gunshots from her home, as well as the sound of a vehicle with a very loud muffler speeding away, and when she looked outside her window and saw that a police officer was now lying on the pavement, she immediately ran outside and called for help on the radio in his patrol car. Paramedics arrived at the scene just over 15 minutes later and transported Lalonde to a local hospital, but by the time he arrived, he was pronounced dead. This marked the first time that a police officer assigned to Station 11 in Kirkland had ever been killed in the line of duty. During this time period, a number of patrol cars were being equipped with video cameras and microphones, but unfortunately, Lalonde's car was still on a waiting list for that, so there was no available audio or video of the traffic stop or the shooting. And since bulletproof vests had not yet been made mandatory by the Montreal Urban Community Police, Lalonde was not wearing one at the time he was shot. Curiously, Lalonde's traffic ticket book could not be found anywhere at the scene, so it seemed apparent that the shooter had taken it with him when he fled. An extensive search was performed for the brown Ford Tempo, and a burned-out car matching its description would soon be found in an industrial section of the Parc Extension neighborhood in the north end of Montreal. The car had been set on fire and was burned so thoroughly that investigators were unable to find any fingerprints or physical evidence which may have pointed towards a suspect. But they eventually learned that the Tempo had originally been stolen from Laval over 1 month earlier, and it was sporting a license plate which was lifted from an entirely different vehicle. In fact, it turned out that a Ford Tempo was used during the commission of a robbery which took place at a branch for the Bank of Montreal in the suburb of Sainte-Anne-de-Bellevue on March the 26th, and the police also looked into the possibility that it may have been used in 2 additional robberies which took place during the same time period. Well, on May the 2nd, a 31-year-old suspect named Charles Boisel was arrested and charged with armed robbery, but even though he was questioned in relation to Lalonde's murder, no additional charges were filed. However, 2 weeks later, police announced that they were looking to identify a second armed robbery suspect who appeared to be around 27 years old and had been captured by the bank's security camera. They wanted to question him about the murder as well, and Detective Lieutenant Jean-François Martin told the press, quote, "We're not saying the man in the photo did it, but we want to question him about the Ford Tempo used in a robbery at a bank in Sainte-Anne-de-Bellevue on March 26th. The car used in the robbery fits the description of the car used by Lalonde's killer." End quote. While this lead was being investigated, Andre Lalonde's funeral service was held in Saint Eustache Church and attended by over 2,000 police officers from various municipalities in both Canada and the United States. Since the chapel only had the capacity to seat 900 people, the rest of the attendees got to hear the service outside while it was played over some loudspeakers. On June the 20th, Lead Inspector Jean Osterguy, head of the Montreal Urban Community Police's Major Crimes Unit, told the press that he believed they were only a few days or weeks away from making an arrest for Lalonde's murder, but this never came to fruition. At one point, it was announced that 6 concerned citizens had pooled together money for a $25,000 reward, which was being offered for information which led to the arrest of the killer, but even though the reward kept getting extended over the course of 1 year, it finally expired in July of 1997. A couple in Senneville who lived across the street from where the shooting took place offered the use of their property to enshrine a memorial for Lalonde, so a bronze plaque was embedded in a rock to pay tribute to him. In January of 2022, the Canadian true crime TV series Crime Beat released an episode about this case titled "The Kindly Cop Who Killed Constable Andre Lalonde." It contained interviews with Andre's son Patrick and daughter Natalie, who had since gone on to have a combined total of 4 children who never got the opportunity to meet their grandfather. The episode also revealed that investigators had a suspect in Andre's murder, though he was not publicly named. But it was mentioned that this man was now serving a life sentence in prison for shooting a man, as well as committing several bank robberies. They also said he was a career criminal who had spent most of his adult life behind bars, but he was a free man during the mid-1990s when Andre's shooting took place. While investigators have continually kept an eye on this suspect, they say they do not have the evidence to charge him with the crime. So after 28 years, the murder of Constable Andre Lalonde continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So if you've watched a lot of cop movies or TV shows, you'll know that one of the more popular tropes is the veteran police officer who is close to retirement, but winds up being killed in the line of duty before they achieve their goal. But tragically, a real-life version of this scenario occurred with Constable Andre Lalonde. It's incredibly sad that this very well-respected veteran had his life stolen away from him after nearly 30 years of service, and he never got the opportunity to enjoy his retirement plans. Nearly 1 year before his death, the Montreal Gazette published a photograph of Lalonde showing a young girl how to use a radar gun, and he has a very jovial smile on his face, which, by all accounts, completely matched his personality. I don't think anyone expected that this photo would then be republished several times by various Quebec newspapers following Lalonde's shooting. I previously mentioned that Constable Andre Lalonde was a recognizable figure in the community because of his distinctive handlebar mustache, but ironically enough, he wound up growing it as a tribute to a former colleague of his who was also killed in the line of duty. In 1974, Lalonde was partnered up with a 39-year-old veteran constable named Aimé Pelletier, who also had a handlebar mustache, but on November the 2nd of that year, Lalonde and Pelletier investigated a robbery which took place at the Ritz Monaco restaurant. During the holdup, one of the patrons, a 43-year-old doctor named Gaston Perrault, was shot to death, but when the two constables pursued the three suspects who were involved, Pelletier was shot in the chest by one of them, and Lalonde would find his partner unconscious outside their squad car, where Pelletier attempted to radio for help. After Pelletier was taken to the hospital, he was pronounced dead on arrival, and it turned out his killer was 25-year-old Arthur Gagné, who had been serving a life sentence at the Cowansville Penitentiary for the 1967 murder of a cab driver, but had been allowed out of the prison on a weekend pass 3 months earlier and failed to return. 1 month after the crime, Gagné fatally shot himself in the head when the police showed up at his apartment to arrest him. Lalonde was left pretty shaken up by Pelletier's murder, but he decided to grow his own handlebar mustache as a tribute to his partner and kept it for the rest of his life. But while Pelletier was fatally shot while in the pursuit of a dangerous suspect, I don't think Lalonde could have ever anticipated that he would also be killed in the line of duty during a routine traffic stop over a noisy muffler. Indeed, the most shocking aspect of Lalonde's shooting was how truly senseless the crime was, as the worst that should have happened was Lalonde giving the driver a ticket. As far as I can tell, Lalonde never even got the chance to speak with the driver, and his brazen reaction has led to speculation that he must have recently committed another crime and was paranoid that Lalonde was going to arrest him. Of course, the ironic thing is that since this seemed like such a routine traffic stop, Lalonde did not radio dispatch to ask them to run a check on the license number, but if he had, he would have learned that the plate had been stolen from another vehicle, and the Ford Tempo itself was stolen over 1 month earlier. The fact that the shooter went on to completely torch this car at another location in order to destroy all possible physical evidence would seem to indicate this guy was a career criminal who had experience at this sort of thing. I'll get back to this angle momentarily, but I thought it was worth mentioning that another Montreal Urban Community Police constable was brazenly shot to death only 5 months earlier. The victim in question was 30-year-old Constable Odette Pinard, a married 9-year veteran with 2 children, who was working alone at Community Station 1A in the Cartierville neighborhood on the afternoon of November the 27th, 1995. Pinard was in the midst of writing a report at the reception desk when, for reasons unknown, an assailant walked inside and shot her in the face at point-blank range before she even had the chance to react. A potential suspect with wavy, white, shoulder-length hair, believed to be between 45 to 50 years old, was seen around the station during this time period, but he has never been identified, and no one could figure out the motive for the crime. There was nothing to indicate that Pinard was personally targeted, as it seemed like whoever did this was planning to shoot whoever happened to be on duty there that day, regardless of who they were. One theory which has been pushed forward is that the shooting was a diversion, as a group of thieves were committing a burglary in another section of town and wanted to ensure that the murder of one of their own would keep the police distracted. While investigators do not believe that Pinard and Lalonde's murders are connected, it was still incredibly jarring to see two Montreal police constables get killed in the line of duty while they were performing routine tasks and were not in the midst of doing anything dangerous. But unfortunately, the sheer randomness of these crimes probably made them more difficult to solve. Getting back to Lalonde's murder, it was believed that the stolen Ford Tempo was used during the commission of one or more bank robberies in the weeks prior to the shooting. I get the impression that a brown Ford Tempo was seen in the vicinity of these robberies, but I'm not sure if it was ever conclusively established if they were the same vehicle. However, if the driver of the Tempo committed the robberies, that would certainly go a long way towards explaining why he would immediately shoot a police officer who pulled him over. Details are vague, but according to contemporary news articles, a suspect named Charles Boisel was charged with armed robbery during this time period, but even though he was questioned about the Lalonde shooting, no murder charges were ever filed. Unfortunately, I could not find any further information about Boisel and what kind of prison sentence he received. As you recall, the Crime Beat episode about this case mentioned that police had a suspect who is currently serving a life sentence for several bank robberies and for shooting a man, but since I haven't heard anything about Boisel shooting a man, I'm not sure if he is the suspect they're referring to. I know that in the weeks following Boisel's arrest, police announced that they were looking to identify a second robbery suspect who had been captured by the bank's security camera, but I'm not sure if they ever did. I do know that in mid-June of 1996, investigators announced that they believed they were very close to arresting someone for Lalonde's murder, but this never happened, so I wonder if this whole angle with the bank robberies came to a dead end. Or it's possible that the police were pretty certain that they had figured out the identity of the perpetrator, but just did not have the evidence to file charges. After all, when you're dealing with a murder in which a victim was shot, it's not like you can just link a suspect to the crime with DNA evidence, and the actual murder weapon has never been found. I get the impression that the authorities have a lot of information which they have not released publicly, and if the person responsible for this crime is serving a life sentence and not getting out of prison anytime soon, then there obviously isn't going to be a lot of urgency to charge him. Investigators have said that they frequently keep an eye on this suspect, and given that he's pretty much reached the point where he has nothing left to lose, I could see him incriminating himself behind bars if he can't resist the urge to run his mouth and make a confession. If this suspect was responsible for the murder, then at least the Lalonde family can take comfort in knowing that he is not out living his life somewhere. I mentioned earlier that Andre's son Patrick and his daughter Natalie were both interviewed on the Crime Beat episode, and it's always sad to hear about murder victims having to miss out on important life events, as I'm sure that Andre would have loved being a grandfather. I hope that Andre's loved ones can eventually receive conclusive answers about who killed him, and we can finally close the books on this case after all these years. So if you happen to have any information about the unsolved murder of Constable Andre Lalonde, or the unsolved murder of Constable Odette Pinard for that matter, you can once again contact Le Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal at 514-280-2222. That's 514-280-2222. Anyway, another special thanks to listener Talia Gilbo-Miskovich for narrating the opening of this episode. We've been carrying on this monthly listener voiceover contest for 7 years now, and if you've already entered, you are automatically eligible for our next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released over 70 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I actually took a break from my usual true crime content and released another movie-themed episode, this time counting down my top 10 favorite movie villains. In addition, I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover a case from Australia about a missing boat, the 1988 disappearance of the Patnella. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of those commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon these past few weeks, and they are Renee F., Claire A., Victoria S., Celeste, and Grant M. Thank you all so much for your support. I'm also excited to announce that this coming fall, I will be attending yet another podcasting event, the Berkshire Podcast Festival, which is taking place in North Adams, Massachusetts from October the 18th to the 20th. Is being organized by Josh Hallmark of the True Crime Bullshit podcast and will feature a number of high-profile shows, including yours truly. If you would like to purchase tickets, please visit their website, berkshirepodcastfestival.com, and use our specialized promo code COLD2024 in order to get a 35% discount on tickets. Once again, that's berkshirepodcastfestival.com and use the promo code COLD2024 to get a 35% discount on tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.